The dry wind whispered secrets through the cracked wooden planks of Pine Hollow, stirring dust into lazy spirals beneath the blood-orange glow of a fading sun. The town lay quiet, as if holding its breath, every shuttered window and weathered sign a testament to years of slow forgetting. But the wind carried something new, a shadow moving steady on horseback, draped in twilight colors, her figure lean and steady against the barren horizon. She rode like a ghost from a half-remembered story, a story that the town had tried to bury beneath layers of silence and scorn. Clara May was coming home. The years had carved lines of strength and sorrow into her face, but her eyes held the same stubborn light that had once frightened Pine Hollow's small minds. They remembered the girl who came here 13 years before, just a child barely touched by the world, and yet carrying a secret that shattered everything. They remembered how she was found beneath the wide sky, with a belly swelling against her will, and a silence sharper than the preacher's sharpest sermon. They had sent her away then, kicked her out before the baby's first cry, told her she was a stain, a burden on the town's thin pride. The church doors closed against her, the schoolhouse barred its windows, and the whispers followed her like a pack of hungry coyotes in the night. But now the same dust she had once fallen into rose again beneath her boots, and Pine Hollow could no longer pretend she was just a forgotten wound. The streets held their breath as Clara dismounted near the well, her fingers brushing the rough rope as if it might remember her touch. The wind tugged at her worn shawl, and for a moment the past breathed back. She could see herself, that trembling girl with a secret too heavy for her shoulders, watching faces turn away, faces that belonged to people who were supposed to love her. Mayor Silas Boone stood at the edge of the square, his lean frame rigid beneath a dust-stained coat. His eyes, sharp and narrow, caught hers, and for a flicker of time, the memory of a father's promise hung between them like a fragile thread. But promises had long since unraveled here. Silas's lips pressed tight, a silent warning cast in shadow. From behind the general store, Ruthie appeared, her face a soft break in the town's hard lines. Ruthie had been the only one who had ever given Clara a kind word, a coat to chase the chill on that night 13 years past. Now older but still gentle, she watched Clara with eyes that carried unspoken apologies and quiet hope. The saloon doors creaked open before Clara could move again. The murmurs inside the town's heart quieted like wind retreating before a storm. Then a voice cut through the hush, cold and sharp as a whip crack. "You shouldn't come back." Samuel. The name struck the air like a bitter echo. The boy who had once sworn he would stand by her side, whose words had crumbled like dry earth beneath the weight of fear and selfishness. His face had grown harder, the boy's softness replaced by something brittle and regretful. Clara's gaze did not falter. Her voice, when it came, was steady and low, folding into the silence without begging or bitterness. "I'm here." A flicker of something passed in Samuel's eyes, shame, anger, maybe a hint of guilt, but he looked away. The room seemed to shrink with the tension, the years of unspoken stories pressing heavy between them. Outside, the sky deepened into violet, and Clara's shadow stretched long across the boardwalk. The wind lifted a few strands of her hair, and she let it fall where it would. There was a quiet resilience in the way she stood, a strength born not from defiance, but from a steady, hard-won grace. The townsfolk watched from behind curtained windows and half-closed doors, their faces masks of curiosity and judgment. They had expected anger, maybe tears, but Clara's silence was a different kind of storm, a calm that unsettled deeper than any outburst. She turned slowly, her boots scraping against the dry earth as she walked past the saloon's heavy doors. The murmurs followed, tangled with the dust in the fading light. At the edge of town, where the wild grass met the broken fence posts, Clara stopped. Her hand brushed a wooden cross, weathered and small, barely marked. No name, no date, just a quiet place beneath an endless sky. She knelt, fingers tracing the rough grain, lips moving in a prayer not spoken aloud. The years had been cruel, but she carried her grief like a hidden fire, never burning bright enough to destroy, only enough to keep her moving forward. Behind her, footsteps slowed. Ruthie's soft voice broke the silence. "You never had to leave, Clara." A breath long and steady. Clara looked up, meeting Ruthie's steady gaze. There was no anger in that look, only a tenderness that had outlasted time and cruelty. "I had no choice." The words floated between them, fragile as a thread in the wind. Ruthie reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn cloth, one Clara had left behind, a token of the girl she was and the woman she had become. "This was yours," she said softly, "for whatever comes next." Clara took the cloth, fingers trembling only slightly. The weight of the past was heavy, but it was no longer a chain. It was a beginning. As the last light slipped beneath the horizon, a figure stepped from the shadows near the edge of town. Elias Kane, the farrier, a man who had never spoken more than necessary, but whose quiet eyes had always held a measure of understanding. He watched her not as the town saw her, but as someone who saw what was beneath the surface, a soul marked not by shame, but by survival. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the faint scent of cedar and smoke, the promise of something waiting to grow in the cracked earth of Pine Hollow. Clara rose, brushing dust from her skirts, and turned back toward the town. The night held 1,000 questions, but in her heart was a steady flame, a promise not just to return, but to remain. Samuel's voice drifted one last time through the chill. "You're not welcome here." Clara's reply was neither loud nor bitter. "I'm here anyway." The shadows deepened, swallowing words and leaving space for the story yet to unfold. The town's silence stretched out beneath the stars, heavy with memory and the quiet hope of change. And so the girl who had been cast out returned, carrying nothing but the weight of years and the fierce light of all she had survived. The story was far from over. It had only just begun. The morning sun filtered through the thin veil of dust that hung over Pine Hollow like a forgotten secret, painting the town's weather-beaten facades in pale gold. Clara May moved with quiet purpose, her boots stirring loose grit as she crossed the uneven boardwalk toward the general store. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the earth itself held its breath, waiting to see what this returning ghost might stir among the settled bones of the past. Inside the dim store, Mrs. Abigail Cartwright, a widow whose kindness was whispered like a blessing through the town, arranged cans of beans with the meticulous care of someone guarding fragile treasures. Her eyes lifted when Clara stepped inside, a soft surprise flickering there before settling into gentle welcome. Abigail's hands trembled slightly, betraying a heart that had hoped for this moment far longer than she dared admit. "Clara," she said, voice as warm as a hearth fire, "you're back." The words carried both a question and an unspoken forgiveness, like the first tentative brush of spring on frost-hardened ground. Clara nodded, lips tight but eyes steady. "I came back to stay." The weight of that simple declaration seemed to settle between them like dust on an old photograph, impossible to ignore, impossible to erase. Outside, the town's usual murmur was punctuated by the clatter of horseshoes on wooden planks and the low murmur of voices that carried suspicion and curiosity in equal measure. From the corner, Eli Kane stood leaning against the post of the blacksmith's forge, the rough edges of his hands evidence of years spent bending iron to his will. He watched Clara with quiet eyes, steady as the river that cut through the valley. He had never spoken much to her before, but there was an understanding in his silence, an acknowledgement that beneath the fierce shell there was a story still unfolding, one written in scars and quiet resilience. Samuel Boone lingered nearby, the town's young mayor, whose confidence had once been fragile and fractured by doubt. His gaze was sharp, filled with a tangled web of regret and resentment. He approached slowly, voice low and uncertain, as if testing the ground beneath his feet. "You don't belong here," he said, words brittle and sharp, yet laced with something softer. Fear, perhaps, or the weight of guilt he could not shed. Clara met his gaze without flinching, the fire of years forged in silence burning behind her steady eyes. "I belong wherever I choose." There was a pause, the kind that stretches long enough to swallow the sound of horses and footsteps and settle heavy over the dusty street. From the shadows of the church, Father Grayson appeared, a figure worn and weathered by time and regret. His voice, when it came, was a soft murmur, more to himself than anyone else. "We all bear the sins of our past," he said, eyes cast downward, "but some weigh heavier than others." Clara's lips pressed together, and for a moment the memories of whispered prayers and cold stares flickered like candlelight in the corners of her mind. Yet beneath the weight of old judgments there was something new taking root. The town had shifted while she was gone, subtle but undeniable, fractures in the foundation, cracks in the stone that might one day give way to something different. As the day unfolded, Clara moved through the town like a quiet storm, her presence unsettling old certainties and awakening long-buried fears. She spoke little but listened more, gathering fragments of conversation like kindling for the fire she was determined to kindle, not with vengeance, but with understanding. Elias met her later by the corral, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows over the worn boards and scattered hay. He handed her a wrapped bundle, a gift or perhaps a peace offering, a worn leather-bound book filled with pages of blank hope and second chances. "It belonged to your mother," he said softly, eyes meeting hers with steady resolve. "She wanted you to have it when the time was right." Clara's fingers traced the embossed cover, the leather soft beneath her touch. It was a tether to a past she had never fully known, and yet it felt like the key to a future still waiting to be written. That evening, as the sky deepened into twilight, the town gathered in the small community hall for a meeting called by the mayor. The room was thick with tension, the air charged with questions that hung heavy and unanswered. Voices rose and fell in hesitant debate. Could the girl who had been cast out really be the one to heal old wounds, or was she a storm that would tear the fragile peace apart? Samuel spoke with forced confidence, his words carefully chosen, but lacking the conviction they once held. "We can't just let the past walk back through our doors," he said, eyes flickering toward Clara, seated quietly at the back. But Clara's reply was calm, steady, unyielding. "The past is already here. It never left. What matters is what we do now." The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling deep like the night that cloaked the town outside. When the meeting ended, Clara stepped out into the cool night air, the stars stretching endless and silent overhead. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and earth, a reminder that life could find a way even in the harshest places. Elias was waiting, his silhouette a steady presence against the dark. "You're not alone," he said simply. Clara looked up, a small flicker of something like hope breaking through the armor of years. Not anymore. Behind them, the town slept uneasily beneath the watchful sky, its heart beating slow but steady, waiting to see if the girl who had once been cast out might become the light that would lead them all home. And in that moment, beneath a blanket of stars, the story began to turn, slowly, quietly, like the first faint notes of a long-forgotten song. The morning light came soft and slow, like a whispered promise, casting gentle shadows across the uneven boards of Pine Hollow's main street. Clara stood at the edge of the town square, the weight of the leather-bound book from her mother resting lightly in her hands, as though it contained the very breath of those who had come before her. Around her, the townsfolk began their quiet routines, dusting windows, tending to horses, exchanging wary glances that spoke volumes of old wounds yet to heal. Elias joined her then, stepping with a measured calm that seemed to draw the restless wind to stillness. His eyes held a tenderness that was both new and ancient, a patient understanding that reached beyond words. For all the silence between them, there was a dialogue deeper than speech, a shared acknowledgement that some battles were fought not with gunpowder, but with quiet grace. "You carry more than a book," he said softly, voice folding into the morning light. "You carry hope." Clara's lips curved into a faint smile, fragile as a spring bloom. "Hope is a stubborn thing," she replied, like weeds breaking through cracked earth. Their conversation was interrupted by the distant clatter of hooves, the sharp patter stirring dust and hearts alike. A figure appeared on the horizon. James Harper, the man who had once turned his back on her, his face weathered with the lines of hard years, but eyes still shadowed with the bitterness of old regrets. He slowed his horse as he reached the square, his gaze flickering between Clara and the gathered crowd, searching for something he dared not name. James dismounted with a heavy grace, the leather creak of his saddle the only sound in the sudden stillness. His voice, when it came, was rough and uncertain, like gravel shifting underfoot. "You shouldn't be here," he said, the accusation barely veiling the tremor beneath. Clara met him without flinch, the fire that had long burned quiet and steady rising just enough to hold her ground. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Around them, the crowd watched, breaths held, and hearts caught in the fragile tension. The years stretched thin between them, like a faded rope fraying at the edges, yet still strong enough to bind wounds both seen and unseen. But before words could ripple further, a sudden commotion broke the fragile calm. From the edge of town came the hurried approach of Sheriff Whitaker, his face drawn tight with urgency. "There's trouble at the East Ridge," he called, voice carrying through the still morning. "A fire started, could spread fast if we don't act." The mention of fire, that ancient terror, sent a ripple through the crowd. Elias and Clara exchanged a glance, unspoken understanding passing between them. Here, in the midst of old grievances and whispered fears, the land demanded their unity. Together, they moved toward the ridge, footsteps quickening with purpose. As they reached the outskirts, the scent of smoke wove thick and raw through the pine-scented air. Flames licked hungrily at dry brush, their orange tongues threatening to consume everything in their path. The townsfolk gathered tools, buckets, shovels, blankets, forming a line against the encroaching blaze. Clara worked beside them, her hands steady despite the heat and urgency. Each movement was a silent promise, a testament to the strength that had grown in the cracks of her exile. As water splashed and dirt was thrown, Elias stayed close, his presence a quiet anchor in the chaos. In the midst of the struggle, James appeared again, his earlier bitterness replaced by grim determination. His voice cut through the roar of flames, issuing orders with the sharp authority of a man who knew the land's cruel moods. Slowly, grudgingly, the townsfolk rallied around the shared goal, the fire burning less like a force of destruction and more like a trial that might forge something new from the ashes. As the last embers smoldered and the danger receded, Clara stood beside Elias and James, the three of them silhouetted against the smoky dawn. There was no victory song, only the slow exhale of a town that had survived and perhaps, just perhaps, begun to heal. Yet beneath the soot and sweat lay an unspoken question: how much of the past could truly be left behind? The scars of rejection and loss still traced faint lines beneath their skin, and the road ahead was uncertain, winding through shadows and light. That evening, as the town gathered once more beneath the wide expanse of twilight, Clara opened the leather-bound book from her mother. The pages, delicate and worn, held letters and memories, stories of strength and love, of hardships faced with quiet dignity. Each word was a thread weaving the tapestry of a lineage that refused to be broken. Elias listened as Clara read aloud, his gaze never leaving her face, his respect deepening with every whispered phrase. The distance between them lessened, bridged by shared stories and the unspoken promise of understanding. In a quiet corner, James watched too, his expression unreadable, caught between regret and a dawning hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. The night stretched on, soft and unbroken, and Clara felt the weight of years settle gently upon her shoulders, not as a burden, but as the foundation of a life reclaimed. And though the future remained veiled in shadow, there was a flicker of light, fragile, persistent, like the first star in a darkening sky, guiding her steps forward into the story still waiting to be told. The night wrapped Pine Hollow in a velvet hush, the stars sprinkled like scattered embers against the endless dark, each one a distant memory shining faintly through the cold. Clara sat alone on the weathered porch of the old homestead, the flickering candlelight inside casting long shadows that danced like ghosts of days gone by. The book lay open on her lap, its fragile pages whispering tales of survival and love, but her thoughts were far from the ink and paper. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grasses, a soft lament that seemed to echo the unsettled rhythm beating within her heart. She had come back for more than just a place on the map. She had come for a reckoning, one that could not be delayed or denied. The town had watched her return with a mixture of wonder and wary eyes, but beneath the surface, old fears and whispered judgments still clung like stubborn dust. Yet here she was, stronger than the drought-stricken earth, soft as the dawn but unyielding as the canyon stone. Elias emerged from the shadows, his silhouette outlined by the fading moonlight. His quiet presence was a balm, a steady pulse in the tangled skein of her doubts. He knelt beside her without a word, the weight of all they had shared hanging between them like a sacred secret. His hand found hers, fingers curling gently, a gesture more eloquent than any speech. "We're standing on the edge of something," he said softly, voice barely more than a breath. "Something worth holding on to." Before she could answer, the silence was shattered by the distant clang of the town bell, sharp, insistent, cutting through the calm like a jagged scar. The gathering storm was coming, whether they were ready or not. Clara rose, her gaze fixed on the flickering horizon where dark shapes moved with purpose and menace. The Harper Ranch was burning. Flames clawed greedily at the dry timber, smoke billowing thick and choking as townsfolk scrambled toward the blaze. The past and present collided in a roaring inferno, memories of rejection and heartbreak igniting alongside the flames. Among the crowd, James Harper stood, his face etched with guilt and determination, the years of bitterness giving way to something raw and desperate. Clara's heart clenched, not for vengeance, but for the fragile hope that perhaps even the deepest wounds might be healed in fire. She stepped forward resolute alongside Elias and a few brave souls who would not let the town be swallowed whole by ruin. The battle against the blaze was fierce and relentless, the heat a brutal reminder of all they had lost and all they still fought to protect. Hands blistered, voices cracked, but the unity forged in shared peril was undeniable. As water was passed and dirt thrown, Clara's mind raced, not with anger, but with a fierce clarity. This land, these people, were tangled into her very soul. To turn away, now, would be to unravel herself. Hours later, as the last embers smoldered and the danger ebbed away, Clara found herself face to face with James beneath the charred remains of the barn. The air was thick with ash and unspoken words. His eyes searched hers, vulnerable and uncertain, the facade of the hardened man slipping away. "I never meant to push you away," he confessed, voice rough with years of regret. "Back then I was scared. And I was weak." Clara studied him, the boy he had been lost beneath the man he'd become. "Scars don't vanish with time," she replied gently, "but they can teach us how to grow." There was a long silence, the kind that speaks louder than any argument or apology. And in that quiet, a fragile understanding blossomed, one built not on forgetting, but on facing the past with courage and grace. That night, beneath a sky brushed with the soft glow of dawn, Clara stood on the porch once more, the book closed but the story far from finished. Elias joined her, and together they watched the town slowly awaken, a canvas wiped clean, yet marked by the echoes of what had come before. She whispered into the cool air, words meant not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been cast out or left behind. Sometimes the greatest journeys lead us back home, not to where we began, but to where we are meant to stand. The wind carried her words, gentle and enduring, weaving through the streets of Pine Hollow and beyond, a quiet invitation to believe in the power of second chances and the unbreakable strength of the human heart. And as the sun rose, painting the world anew with hues of hope and promise, Clara knew that her story, like the land she loved, was still growing, stretching wide with all the endless possibility of a wild frontier sky.